The Miskatonic was burning. Something had been done to the water. Not to the river, but to the water itself. Blue flames were moving across the shallows, swirling like leaves in the autumn wind. Kane didn't know what it meant, but he knew it couldn't be good. If anything, it probably meant that things were going to get worse. Probably much worse. Reinforcements had been delayed, air support had been stalled because of a communication snafu, and command had lost contact with the amphibious forces coming up the river. His squad was passing over the Peabody Avenue Bridge, and the eerie illumination cast a strange dance of light and shadows about the ruins of the city. It was just the impetus Kane needed to reassess. Well, everything, really. The most merciful thing in the universe is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Thurston's paradigm. Kane had learned it in a class on modern philosophy back before the war started, before thousands of years of human progress was devoured by the ravening hordes of alien hybrids. He had been a student then, an environmental engineering major, but to Kane that was a lifetime ago, and luxuries, like philosophy and constructed wetlands, had been replaced with energized assault weapons and radiation ablative armor. Command had designated the area south of the river as contested territory. Truth was, the university had been an enemy beachhead since day one. Intel suggested that along with similar sites in California, Oregon, Florida, London, Moscow, and Tokyo, Miskatonic University had been ground zero for the invasion. Problem being that no one really recognized it as an invasion. It wasn't until the CDC and WHO and WHO had failed to contain the outbreaks that the military was called in, but by then it was too late. What had begun as a strange genetic anomaly affecting only a handful of people worldwide had become infectious, and then exploded into a battle to save not just nations, not just humans, but all life on the planet. And to hear the brains talk, maybe even the universe. On the south side of the bridge, the team moved 2 blocks south through the burned-out merchant district and took up defensive positions in the old Arkham graveyard at the top of French Hill. The target, the university library, was 2 blocks due west. It didn't sound far, a 10-minute walk on a normal day. But normal days were long gone, and all the reports said that the area was crawling with Whateleys and worse, at least 2 Vug Shogog. It was going to be a street fight, building to building. Progress measured in the death of things that used to be human, things that used to be people, normal, everyday people that had succumbed to Morgan's syndrome. Energized assault weapons versus 10-foot-long tentacles with jaws filled with snapping teeth and weird drill-like claws. Kane was in charge of a bloodbath waiting to happen, all to rescue a few books from the library. The street fight was a diversion. Despite their monstrous size, unnatural weaponry, and inhuman reasoning, the enemy had a serious weakness. Their thinking was two-dimensional. The things simply couldn't rationalize fighting in multiple elevations simultaneously. Come at them from the ground alone, and they would fight you to a standstill. Come at them from the sky, and the damned things would start hurling makeshift artillery, forcing anything airborne to withdraw. Do both, attack with ground and air support, or even with just elevated snipers, and the Whateleys just froze. They couldn't focus their attention. They would swing wildly from one direction to another. It was as if the very concept of attacks coming from multiple elevations was completely alien to them. They just couldn't comprehend that things happening in multiple planes could be impacting them at the same instant. The brains said it had to do with how they perceived space. They thought in angular terms rather than curves. This was why their movements were always linear with sharp 90-degree turns, like the eponymous target in the classic video game Centipede. This weakness formed the tactics for the mission at hand. Kane and his squad would assume positions on top of the hill east of the campus. and initiate an assault that would draw the enemy away from the library. Amphibious forces would lend support from the river, while special forces were dropped from the air directly into the campus. Once the special forces had secured the objective, they would rendezvous with the infantry on French Hill and be evacuated from there. Static crackled from the plug in Kane's ear, a shrieking "zzz." Instinctively, he reached for the spot on his back where the cable from his helmet plugged into the cylinder strapped to his back. A sudden but mild shock made his hand jerk back as the static resolved into something resembling a voice.
Kane, you have been instructed not to interfere with the communications interface.
Kane nodded slightly. Sorry, reflex action. With radio equipment, static can indicate a loose connection. Another spurt of static spurted into his ear.
We are not radios, Kane, and static is a byproduct of the translation process. There are concepts, protocols, words that have no counterpart in human languages. The translator and your brain interpret these as static, but they are not. You have been told this before. If you cannot understand that, perhaps I should find another host.
That won't be necessary, Phillips. I apologize, and I'll keep my hand to myself.
You must learn, Kane.
Kane winced.
Contact has been re-established with both and they are in position. Romero squad is go for engagement.
Kane signalled Romero's squad, and without a word he and the 5 soldiers under his command rose up to take positions and find targets with their scopes. The weapon felt good as it settled in against his shoulder, and the scope engaged with his helmet display. At 200 times magnification, the occupants of the university grounds jumped into horrific detail. They swarmed the campus. Kane counted more than 6 Whateleys in the central quad alone. It was hard to believe these things were once human, or at least mistaken for human. The invaders had hidden themselves in plain sight. It wasn't until the sun started tossing high-energy solar flares, and the light had shifted toward indigo, that anybody started to notice that there were monsters in our midst. Not even the monsters themselves had known. Morgan's inherited dysmorphism syndrome, MIDS for short, had been first diagnosed among newborns in western Massachusetts in the late 20s and early 30s of the 20th century. Children were born with severe teratological defects that would make thalidomide babies look comparatively normal. Dr. Morgan found dozens of kids with the most monstrous mutations, including tails, gills, hooves, tentacles, even functional mouths and eyes in places other than the kids' faces. All the kids had been born to mothers who had been raped, and Morgan theorized that the rapist had been linked to the Dunwich event, a supposedly natural nuclear explosion that had devastated the landscape for nearly 100 square miles. Paranormal researchers called it the American Tunguska, and liked to suggest that the explosion of a flying saucer had caused the disaster. Morgan took his report to the authorities, but between cleaning up the Dunwich event, occupying the town of Innsmouth, and a deadly hurricane in Florida, the federal government had apparently been overwhelmed. By the time action was taken, most of the children and their mothers were gone, vanished into the wilderness that was Depression-era America. Kane watched through the scope as a particularly large Whately reared up its head and lashed a tentacle into the air. They were called Whateleys because that was the name Morgan gave to the man from Dunwich to whom he attributed all the rapes, though calling Wilbur Whateley a man may have been overly generous. From the reports, Cain had read Wilbur had died when a dog ripped out his throat down in the very university they were preparing to assault. Examination of the body had revealed similar teratologies, tentacles, eyes, hooves, to those found on the children. Attempts to preserve the body failed. In a matter of hours Wilbur had dissolved into nothingness. It was another trait shared by his descendants. There was something goatish about the creatures. The eyes, the fur, the horned growths on the head reminded Cain of paintings he had seen of devils and demons. But nothing he had ever seen had ever suggested the fusion of monstrosities that formed the rest of the body. Arms and legs ending in massive elephantine hooves, tentacles springing from a body the size of a small car, tentacles ending in eyes or mouths or spikes or claws. No two Whateleys were ever identical, but they seemed uniform in their desire to breed and feed on anything that moved. Cain took a deep cleansing breath and gave Romero Company the go code. He flipped the safety off and gently, almost lovingly pulled the trigger of his weapon. The Tillinghast railgun, the weapon his squad was armed with, used superconducting magnetic coils to accelerate explosive shells to supersonic velocities. The Whateleys were resistant to most small arms fire, but at supersonic velocities, coupled with explosive impacts, the shells were able to penetrate armor and deliver their contents into the bodies of the enemy. Lead was the poison of choice, and if someone had discovered that early on, things might not have gotten as bad as they had after Morgan's reappearance in 2012. When the sun shifted, the emergency rooms had been flooded with crazies who feared the worst was upon us. It wasn't, and most of their symptoms were psychosomatic. But there was a small minority who were generally affected. Humans couldn't see into the ultraviolet, but dozens of people were suddenly showing up screaming that the sun had gone black. These people were the first hint of what was going on. Their eyes had the ability to detect wavelengths beyond those in the normal range of human vision. At first, researchers thought this condition was the result of a genetic mutation, something linked to the mother's X chromosome, or something in the mitochondrial DNA. Wrong on both counts. Surprisingly, they found something entirely new, something they called a gammaplast, an unknown organelle that had characteristics in common with both mitochondria and plant chloroplasts, the places where energy was produced for cells. The gammaplast functioned much like a chloroplast, but instead of turning light into cellular energy, it used gamma radiation, something the sun was now emitting in significantly higher quantities. By design, the Tillinghast shell arced through the air. If you tried to fire in a straight line, the Whateleys simply moved out of the way. They were monstrously fast. Fire in arcs, and they couldn't see the shell until it was too late. Cain lost count as he fired round after round into the maddening hordes that occupied the college grounds. The gammaplast also contained a massive amount of DNA. Human chromosomal DNA being linear, with 46 chromosomes, the stuff in the gammaplast was hexagonal, containing more than 300 chromosomes. This was the source of the ability to see ultraviolet. It was also the source of the changes to come. It turned men and women into Whateleys, and then as they grew larger into the composite things called Vug Shagog. Damn it! How had he missed that? There was a goddamn Vug coming down the street right towards him. If Whateleys were the size of cars, then Vugs were bigger than a city bus. The things made Whateleys look like kittens. Hell, if a Whateley got in a Vug's way, it would tear it apart as soon as go round it. 50 feet of living nightmare was swarming up the hill. It was a quarter-mile away and moving fast. The shells were penetrating, but they weren't slowing it down. The thing was too big, the lead too slow to interfere with the gammaplast and shut the thing down. In half a minute, maybe less, they would be overrun. "Phillips, we have a Vug!" Where is that support?
Is in ground.
Kane took aim and fired into the primary head of the thing as it moved out of the college and made its way across Garrison Street. A heartbeat later, a cluster of facial tentacles exploded in a smear of green and black smoke. But in that time the thing had crossed Garrison and was now weaving up Litch Street towards his position. Less than half a block, and the thing would be on them. The squad was concentrating fire, but to little avail. God, that thing was fast. Where was the support? He heard it before he saw it. A buzzing sound like a swarm of bees. It drowned out all the other noises, the screams of the Whateleys, the recoil of the guns, the roar of the Vug. All were lost as the sky filled with dozens of airborne special forces. No larger than a man, 7 Migo warriors came at the Vug from above and behind. Kane knew that their fungoid allies repulsed some people, but to his mind they were beautiful. An oblong egg-shaped exoskeleton, seemingly woven from some sort of resin, extruded a dozen crustacean-like appendages and multiple pairs of translucent wings. The head reminded Kane of a coral, or a mould, or perhaps even an exposed brain, folded and creased with half a dozen stalked sensors, craning about, tasting the world more than seeing it. As the Vug reared up to strike at the Migo, Kane saw 3 more of the flying creatures dart into the clouds, heading away from the city, and he knew that sometime during the opening of the firefight, special forces had been delivered safely. A sudden movement drew his attention back to the ground. The Migo had distracted the Vug, causing it to focus its attention skyward. And that was all that was needed to allow the Marines to come in. Kane watched a lone soldier with 300 pounds of heavy armour on dart into the street. Using what amounted to an immense steel syringe, the soldier speared the Vug just below the neck, pumping the beast full of a lead-based toxin. The harpoon still lodged in the Vug's neck, the Marine rolled away as the worm thing began to thrash about in agony. Kane's team held their fire, giving the Marine a chance to find cover and time for the poison to do its job. The Vug was a composite creature, its strength coming from its ability to decentralize some functions and combine others. Separate the monster into its component parts, and those individuals became just as vulnerable as any other Whately. The poison that the Marine had delivered was also chock full of DMSO, a solvent with such a high transmissivity that it had spread the lead compounds right into the central nervous system. In response, the Vug was tearing itself apart, trying to separate contaminated pieces from those that were uncontaminated. It was like watching a child shake apart a stack of Legos. The individual parts became easy targets for Romero's squad. The Vug was down, but it had been only the first assault on their position. Kane ordered suppressing fire as the Whateleys began to swarm up after their fallen brethren. Kane personally covered the Marine as he dashed straight up the road and took shelter behind a low rock wall about 20 feet away. The wall did little to hide the bulk of the amphibious soldier. He was easily 7 feet tall and more than 3 feet wide. Even at this distance, Kane could smell the Marine. They all smelled the same, like the sea at low tide. It was pheromonal, something emitted by their gills. Kane called over. "What's your name, soldier?" The armour-clad Deep One made his way over to Kane's position in a fluid grace that reminded Kane less of running and more of a cross between gymnastics and ballet. "Howard, sir. Riku squad, or what's left of it. It has been one hell of a day. Intel said there were only Whateleys and 2 Vug. They failed to mention the polyp that ambushed us as we came out of the river." Kane nodded as he fired at another Whately that had crossed the imaginary line that his mind had drawn down the centre of Garrison Street. "Typical. I'm Kane. The brain in the backpack is Phillips." Kane's earpiece roared to life.
Kane, I don't appreciate the humor. Now, the target has been secured, and the courier is en route to your position.
Howard, are you still armed? Howard shook his head. Only thing I have left is a grenade, and you don't want me to use that until we're ready to leave. Kane had seen a grenade go off before, and he had no desire to see this one do its work until he was well on his way out. Kane stared down at the swarm of Whateleys. They had reached the near side of Garrison and were working inevitably forward. Kane and his team were slowing them down, but the horde was going to reach them, and when that happened the Tillinghast railguns would be useless. The package is on its way in. I was kind of counting on Riku's squad to help us defend this position, but it looks like we're going to have to go on the offensive. Any objection to going in for a pickup? Howard's lidless eyes grew large and his gills flexed nervously. Begging your pardon, sir, but those special forces types give me the creeps. I'm with you, brother, but we both know that you're a hell of a lot faster than he is, and frankly, the sooner we get out of here, the better. Howard figured this out just seconds after Kane. You have a plan? Kane did have a plan, one that just might get them out alive. With care, Kane repositioned his men onto Lidge Street. Cover had ceased to matter once the Vug had started toward them, and as long as he kept out of the striking range of the tentacles, the squad would hopefully remain intact. Evenly spaced, the 5 men under Kane's command began slowly moving down the avenue, railguns blazing, Kane and Howard right behind them. When they reached Parsonage Street, he ordered one of the men straight down the centre while the other 4 split into 2 teams and took up crossfire positions on top of abandoned cars. From a slightly safer position, Kane fired into the maddened horde of monsters as Howard searched for any sign of the courier. To the south, halfway down the block, a small figure broke from the shadows, and in an instant Howard was dancing down the street like a deranged frog. Kane smiled and tried to stay focused. The boy had guts.
Kane, we're running low on ammo. At the current rate of consumption, the team will be out in 2 minutes.
Damn it! Kane ordered the team to a more controlled rate of fire. The Whateleys surged forward, closing the gap in a mere instant. Howard, we have to go! Phillips, send the evac signal. Kane took a step back from the front line.
Do we have the package?
An alarm sounded in Kane's helmet. The man walking down the centre line was out of ammo. Howard, we have to go now. Phillips, send the evac signal. A second alarm sounded. The thing crept closer.
Do we have the package?
A third alarm. Send the goddamn signal! Howard, where the hell are you? A fourth alarm. A dam broke, and the wave crashed over into Parsonage Street. 5 more alarms went off, notifying Kane that the soldiers he had been commanding were gone. The reanimated bodies of Romero's squad had ceased to function. Suddenly he was in the air. As he made a mad dash toward the graveyard like a deranged quarterback. Phillips! We need evac now!
Do we have the package?
Kane glanced over to the figure tucked under Howard's right arm. It was a hideous thing, as if a rabid jackal had been fused with a man. It reeked of death and decay, of decomposing flesh and sewage, the odours not of its own making, but rather of its food. Ghouls preferred the contents of their meals to be at the minimum of several weeks old. Kane gagged at the stench, but swallowed the rising wave of vomit as he saw the case being held by the corpse-eater. We have the package! We have the package! Now get us the hell out of here!
Evacuation signal sent.
There was something vaguely comical about all this. Cain and a ghoul, tucked underneath the arms of a deep one, running through a graveyard being chased by slobbering hordes of mutant hybrids. Comical in the sense that such a thing would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. War makes strange bedfellows. When the Whateleys attacked, man thought he was alone. The general populace didn't know about the deep ones, ghouls, and the Migo, or the human brains the Migo had been stealing for millennia. They didn't know they shared the world, the solar system, with things that seemed horrifying, but compared to the Whateleys were just distant cousins. The Migo weren't the worst, of course. There were others more alien, but at least they weren't extra-dimensional. The Yith and the Corel were enigmatic, but at least they could be reasoned with. The deep ones could even control Shoggoths. Cain stared at the phalanx of Whateleys. They were faster than Howard, and it was plain that they weren't going to make it. Plain and simple. Something had to be done, and Cain knew what that something was. "Phillips, I am sorry." He reached around and ripped the cylindrical brain case off his back. The electric shock came, but Cain fought through it and shoved the metallic casing into one of the loops on Howard's belt. Then, without missing a beat, he grabbed the last of Howard's grenades, and with a swift but well-targeted motion, pounded on Howard's elbow with his free hand. Reflex kicked in, and Howard's arm opened, sending Cain tumbling to the ground. As he rolled, Cain saw the kid pause. He barked an order. "Keep moving, Howard! Deliver that goddamn package!" The Whateleys were just yards behind him now. He could hear them pounding, crawling, slithering up the hill. Without hesitation he pulled the pin on the grenade and tossed it in the direction of the Whateleys. In his head he counted. 1, 2, 3. There was an audible click. Cain heard a goddamn click. And then the world exploded, filled with proto-Shoggoth matter and pain. Cain never heard the buzzing sound that filled the skies. He never saw the protoplasmic Shoggoth swallow up the Whateleys, never saw the Migo swoop down and pluck Howard and the courier out of the graveyard. Cain never saw these things, never heard them, because the proto-Shoggoth swallowed him up, blew him out, and sent him flying like so many pieces of meat. He only learned about these things later when they brought him back. Not his body, of course, that was gone. But they found his head, and the Migo carefully sealed his brain into a metallic cylinder and set Cain to work. He works with Phillips and all the other brains. They work on the package, trying to pry loose its secrets. Every once in a while someone, usually someone with a body, will ask him if it was worth it. He pauses for a moment. He stares through artificial eyes at the ancient pages. Somewhere in this book is the key to freedom. Not just for humans, but for all the peoples of the world. Maybe the universe. Was it worth it? Deep within the last city of men, in the forgotten recesses of Kadath in the cold wastes, Cain thinks.
Yes.
And goes back to his task of translating the Necronomicon.